Okay, gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us. And I know this is a huge topic, and I appreciate you kind of squeezing it down to something that is digestible for folks. I'd like to start with unpacking the idea that Ben brought up or sort of pointed to um, in the idea that there could even I mean, I think for most of our people, it's not going to even sort of occur to them that there's another option besides incarceration. Like, how else could we handle this? I mean, we have to have something, right? So, what would some alternatives be? And I think closely related to that, how does this concept of what's commonly known as defunding the police, what I would prefer to say is redirecting resources or reprioritizing resources. How is that related? Um, I don't know who wants to jump in first. Richard, you had some energy, and maybe.
I think Richard always has energy.
Oh,
That's
okay,
just
fair enough.
Y'all tell me for 30 minutes and y'all already know that.
Yeah. That's really funny.
Yeah, okay. So for the first part on like what we can do. So the way I like to frame this with most people is reframing our starting points. If prisons and by virtue policing, since policing is the entryway into the prison system, we should let's reprioritize what our starting point is. Those things don't have to be where we start the conversation, because the conversation is, if someone does this, what do we do first? But that's thinking first about a reaction to something. But what we can start to think about first is, what are some of the things that led to this action? Or what are some of the things that can limit the potential for these things to happen in communities? Like some very basic things are like some common, I won't say basic because that can people, that's a different population for people. So some common things that we can do is thinking about how we prioritize resources within our communities first. So oftentimes crime is related to poverty. So let's start our conversations by, do people have access to education? Do people have access to skills and job training programs? Do people have access to um, transportation to get to said job? So there's a lot of different ways we can think first about, instead of reacting to a potential crime, what are those things that we can do to limit it from happening to begin with? What are things that we can do to first build up our communities rather than like responding to something that might happen within it? And that's where like the defund stuff comes from. So rather than responding to a crisis or a situation, why don't we first start by making sure that all of our citizens in our community have access to transportation? So spending more money on that, or for skills and jobs training, there's community centers for people to go to. For education, there's after school programming for our kids. For people struggling with addiction, there's mental health and education programs available for people. For homelessness, again, there's lots of different things that we can do to address some of the typical issues that occur in our community first. And that's where we can redirect funding for resources first. So I like to think of it as building up our communities first rather than prioritizing the role that policing and or prisons have in our communities. So that's kind of like my brief breakdown.
Right. So I like that way of framing it in terms of policing is really on the back end of the sort of uh, action reaction, or maybe circumstance action reaction equation. It's sweeping up something that's already happened, reacting to. Whereas investing on the community reframes the circumstances in which people take action, so that then we don't have to have the reaction. I'm reminded constantly in these discussions of a meme that I saw recently that said, the safest communities don't have the most police.
Correct.
The safest communities have the most resources.
Correct. And that's like, well, you can look at wealthy areas even within like the region that we're in like North Texas area. Like you can look at Collin County, North Richland Hills, lots of areas that are more affluent. They actually have less policing in those neighborhoods because they have the resources they need to make. They have the necessary resources. And I bet if you ask some of the people who live in those neighborhoods if they feel more safe or less safe in their communities, they're probably going to say more safe.
Yeah, and I think a helpful way to frame this, maybe this way of thinking about it for our listeners, might be to think about the move that health insurance companies have made in the last several years towards preventive care. So health insurance companies have actually tried to financially incentivize preventive care because they know that dealing with a problem on the back end, a health problem on the back end, is far more expensive than if we prevent it in the first place, right? I mean, that seems really basic economics. Well, apply that to a community. And just think of so-called crime or lack of safety as any other kind of unhealthy condition in the body. If we can prevent that from occurring by investing on the front end, then we don't have to buy all the expensive drugs and treatments on the back end to clean up the problem. Is that a fair way of characterizing it?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Ben,
Yeah.
I wonder if you have some thoughts about theological alternative ways of framing containment and incarceration. I mean, how can we get out of this way of framing the world?
Yeah. So I think that there are several distinctions that I think are actually have been really helpful for me, that I think are important to make here when we are talking about what are the things that we want to invest in that would actually make communities safe, that would not be continuing to invest in containment and enclosure. I want to make the point as well, though, that it is very, very important I think for white people in particular, to really work to displace the notion that police and prisons are currently providing safety. Because the way this is usually framed is that if we got rid of or reduced or anything,
Right.
police and prisons, it would just be the wild, wild west. We would all be, this and that, right? And police and prisons are actually drivers of violence. So it's not even the case that and I'll make a couple of examples of what I mean about how police and prisons are actually making us less safe right now. So there's a couple of reasons for this. One is that, and also just the basic point, right? We spend every year upwards of $80 billion as a nation every year on police and prisons. And so if incarceration worked to actually keep us safe, this is a point that Danielle Sured makes in her book, Until We Reckon, which if people are looking for some places to start on the harm and the ineffectiveness of incarceration, Danielle Sured's book, Until We Reckon, is a great place to start. But one of the points she makes is if incarceration did in fact make us safe, we would be the safest nation in the world. We would be have the safest communities in the world. And instead, by all measures, we are one of the most violent places in the world. As she pulls the statistics of, for example, according to Dana Surratt, every year nearly 3,000 young men of color are murdered every year before their 25th birthday. More than 57,000 children, 57,000 children survive sexual violence. Nearly half of women experience domestic violence. Nearly 3 million people are robbed or assaulted every year. Countless transgender people are killed for who they are. If incarceration worked to stop violence, we would have done that. So that the reason why I think this point is important is that people, is that it's not just that we need to invest in other things. It's that what we're investing in right now doesn't deliver on the things that people usually think it does. So for example, another example when it comes to, because the question that people pose, and I think more so nowadays in good faith about what do we do with the murderers and the rapists? That used to be a question that I would have to face a lot from people in bad faith. It's more in good faith now, where people are genuinely recognizing the harm that incarceration does in this moment. And one of the points there that RAIN makes, it's a national organization. I cannot remember the acronym now. RAIN is, oh my goodness. Anyhow, it's a organization that deals with sexual assault. And out of about every 1,000 cases of sexual assault, 5 people are incarcerated. So do the math. That's 99.5% of people are there. Nothing happens. So this question of what do we do with the murderers and the rapists, this is something that Miriam Kaba has taught me, is what are we doing right now? You're already living with them. Not only are we already living with them, as in nothing actually effective is being done anyways. Most of the people who do the most egregious forms of harm don't end up in the legal system anyways. Not only is that the case, but many of them have positions of power. They are politicians, they are CEOs. So the people running the world are the people that we kind of go, oh my goodness, what would happen if we got rid of these systems? And the reason, though, that incarceration, I just want to read before I kind of stop here a minute, because we could talk about this point a lot. Yeah. But I think it matters a lot because when we talk about what do we need for real safety, it means investing in all the things that Richard mentioned, investing in healthcare, investing in and guaranteeing housing and healthcare generally, mental health care, education. But it also means investing in community-based solutions to harm that actually address harm. Incarceration doesn't address harm. It punishes people who do harm, who, as Daniel Surratt points out, are nearly always victims of harm themselves. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. So I know you want to read this quote, but I just want to pause there.
That was deep, Ben.
Yeah. Especially because, Ben, I know you and I talked about the possible relationship between the concepts of harm and sin. But harm, I would just say that again. Incarceration does not address harm.
Correct.
Right.
Right?
Right.
Incarceration punishes people who caused harm, who are often the victims of harm themselves.
Right.
So here's a cycle. Okay. Mm-hmm. And, to just use one example, and this is not what we're talking about, but it's sometimes helpful for folks to kind of put some flesh on an idea.
Yeah.
The Truth and Reconciliation Commission work in the wake of apartheid in South Africa did not result in incarceration. They did result in the reparation of harm in the most part, right? So here's an example where harm was done. That harm was not criminalized, but was rather repaired, or the best work that could be done to try to repair it, and restoration. right? That's what we defined in the beginning of the previous episode as justice, restoration. So, Ben, your quote then.
Yeah. No, that's really, okay.
Yeah.
So let me read this real quick then, and then I want to let Richard or anyone who wants to think about this distinction, we'll repeat it in just a minute. So the thing that Daniel Sered points out is that there's a lot here. I literally said to myself, we could read like 3 pages of this, but in lieu of doing that, the reasons, though, really, when you think about it, right, just think about why incarceration is limited, as not only limited as a tool for addressing violence and harm, because really that's the thing I think people are asking about when they ask about what would we do without. Because there's a lot of things, for the most part, this is also why I don't really talk about alternatives to incarceration, because we don't need an alternative to everything that people are being locked up for right now. Most things need to be decriminalized. But for harm, we need actual responses to harm that will address the harm, and as you said, Jeffrey, repair. So as Daniel Sered says that, quote, not only does incarceration fail to interrupt the drivers of violence, and drivers of violence being, for example, poverty, inequity, lack of opportunity, shame and isolation. Not only does incarceration fail to interrupt those things, it also, on the individual level, incarceration is driven, or our incarceration is itself structured by shame, isolation, exposure to violence, and an inability to meet one's economic needs. So what drives violence? Shame, isolation, exposure to violence, and an inability to meet one's economic needs. What are the core features of being incarcerated? Shame, isolation, exposure to violence, and an inability to meet one's economic needs. The point that Daniel Sered makes is that we have literally built into our response to violence the very things that drive violence. So yes, the distinction then between sin and crime that we talked about, I think it is what you're referring to, Jeffrey, and Richard has made that distinction as well. So I'll pause right now in case someone else wants to jump in on that point.
Actually, I think it was sin and harm.
Oh yes.
Oh yeah, no.
Because I was saying, when we understand that sin is broken relationship, okay, sin is grounded in an act that breaks relationship. So there's a harm there that's opened up, and that is why this is defined as sin, because of the harm opened up in the broken relationship. The action itself is not sin. It's the broken relationship that needs to be repaired, which is why, conversely, justice and righteousness, which biblically are the same concept, are restored relationship. Now, both of you are theologians. I don't need to explain this to you, but if we understand sin that way, rather than bad acts that are inherently bad, then I think we have a different way of understanding the relationship there. Does that resonate with you?
Yeah.
Yep. Richard.
Yeah, no, y'all said pretty much everything I was gonna say on that, but I'll just say this, that it is important when we're thinking about the criminal punishment system to make those distinctions. And if you want to add the Christian context to that distinction between what we consider everything that is sinful, isn't criminal, and by vice versa, everything that's considered a crime, isn't sinful. So like, I only bring that up just to make this point. Like, the American justice system has, or in many sense, and for many people of faith, the American justice system like equates sin and crime without making any clear-cut distinctions. So for us, as we think through our own faith and within, and not just think through our own faith, but with our faith communities, like it's important that we make some of those distinctions ourselves. And like I looked at y'all's website and I saw that y'all one of the things that I've kind of like one of the things that's like really important to me is thinking about LGBTQ plus people and their important role within church and within church communities. Like if we don't make that distinction, like from a faith-based perspective and from a social perspective, like you see that as like not only is it sinful, it's criminal, and that has like draconian and like terrifying consequences for communities of people. So that's why it's important for us to think of those in both like our faith commitments as well as like how we see that in relation to law and legal systems. That's it. Tried to keep that brief.
Yeah, this is fascinating to me theologically, and I'm tempted to fall off the cliff of exploring how atonement theories, and particularly penal substitutionary atonement, play into this whole construct. Because
Another day. Another live stream some other time.
Yeah.
Something I just find, I think something about talking about mass incarceration or the criminal system, like all of that stuff, it just, much like talking about racism, systemic racism, it is overwhelming because it seems so big. But
Correct.
I think that one of the things is we talk about, what are practical things that we can do that will help in the long run remove the problem of mass incarceration. I think of things like, fighting against food deserts and making sure that there are grocery stores that are accessible, working for public transportation, making sure that people can get around. That's an issue we have here in Mesquite, right?
Yeah.
Making sure that schools have the resources that they need so that kids have access to all of the things that they need in school, not based on their socioeconomic status, but based on the fact that they deserve to have access to those things in their schools because they're human beings. Making sure, so there are little things that by working toward those, and I think, and I talk about these things because a lot of these things are things we've talked about in other episodes of Face to Face. And I think that it's really important for us to recognize how each of those little, as we'll call them little, not really, but each of those instances of covert or maybe not so covert racism all come together and often intersect, or come together in a intersection with mass incarceration. Like this is a real nexus point, I guess.
And as an organizer, that's one of the reasons why organizing around issues around the criminal punishment system is actually really strategic, because it is exactly that. It's where all of these different systems of oppression and the ways in which people are, don't have access to the resources they need and that sort of thing come together. And I think for white folks in particular, I'm hoping that we can continue to push white people to understand that their role in working against mass incarceration, against the criminal punishment system, is not just as an ally in a struggle that is not yours, but that this is our struggle too. That we are, in fact, and this is really clear when you look at budgets, right? That these things are connected. And so what we what the goal to me is how to really understand the ways in which the struggles are different that people are experiencing, and we need to understand how those different struggles are connected in ways that are actionable for us. And I think that that's exactly what a lot of what these budget campaigns, though, as well do, right? So anyhow, yes, I think that the point that they come together means it's strategic for us to push here.
Yeah.
So, go ahead.
No, that was literally what I was gonna say. The other strategy is like participating in budget meetings, like
Right.
those type of things, because a lot of people don't realize that those are like pretty effective ways of being involved. Yeah.
So I want to lift up two victories that we've had that St. Stephen has been a part of and must continue to be a part of, and Faith in Texas, and I'm sure Fight Toxic Prisons as well. One is our own work here in St. Stephen to move the needle on our CBDG, that is Community Development Block Grant Consolidated Report. The advocacy and resident participation that we engaged in during that process moved the needle on priorities that are the priorities that are stated in that plan. Now we have to continue to work, keep the city accountable to those priorities which we've named. But that is, over the course of the next 4 years, $5 million that will come directly into Mesquite, that we have some say in how that's invested in our communities. Okay.
Yeah.
The second victory that I want to lift up was one coordinated through Faith in Texas, and that was participation in the county's, Dallas County's budget process, which was able to move, correct me if I'm wrong, Ben, $5 million, move that on the ledger over to community investment in terms of mental health services and maybe housing. I'm not sure. Is that correct? Am I stating that right?
There are some evictions protections in it. So in that sense, it does touch on housing. Yes. Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Now, in the county budget, $5 million is not a whole lot. It is a drop in the bucket, right? But what that says is that they heard us and they responded to us. And now it's incumbent upon us to continue to do the work, hold our city managers and city apparatus and county apparatus accountable to making these dollars that have been set aside work in the way that we intend them to work, so that when we go back to the county next time, we're not moving $5 million from one side of the ledger to the other. We're moving $20 million or more. So, congratulations and thanks to all the people at Faith in Texas and partner organizations who helped in that advocacy.
And an important distinction as well there is the $5 million that was not moved out of the jail budget. They are unwilling to touch the jail budget, which is why I think it is going to be important for us to address the ongoing harm that investment in the jail budget is doing. So anyhow, but yes, the $5 million was absolutely a victory, and I think that is something to celebrate for sure.
You look like you're going to say something.
Well, yeah, no, I'm good. I was just thinking about, I guess I can say we got, 45 seconds. The the similarities between not wanting to remove budget money from policing and jails and prisons and not wanting to remove funding from the oil industry.
Okay.
I get that we're fearful of removing jobs because we don't want people to lose jobs, right? So, I think that the big big question is, how do we shift? How do we pivot, if we want to use a 2020 word? How do we pivot in a way that maintains job security for folks, but also starts moving us in the direction of restoration? That's just okay. Final thoughts. Sorry.
Yeah.
Yep. It seems to me this topic brings together. I mean, we've already identified it as a nexus for so many other matters of covert racism. But I'm also reminded in reviewing Ben and Richard, the things that you brought to our attention, how this issue of mass incarceration is I want to say the tail end, but I fear that it's not the tail end, right? That there's more to come. But that there is a direct line between, I now have to say, the myth of progressive gains that we were taught we made in the 1960s with the Great Society and the, quote, war on poverty, which really was not the war on poverty that we were taught it was.
For important Black people.
Right. So the war on poverty actually was actually a war on the poor, and that the war on the poor led to the war on drugs, which intensified the war on those individuals. And that led directly to this movement towards criminalization, and which led to mass incarceration, which is now where we are today. And I mean, we could throw in there the militarization of the police.
Correct.
Right?
Yep. Yep.
All of these things are results of I mean, this is the part that I just have to I get a little, taste in the back of my mouth. They are the result of a progressive myth that we have to be willing to face and unmask.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That we are not actually as far along as we want to think we are.
Correct.
Well, and the very things that we were taught were headed in one direction, were actually headed in the wrong direction.
Yeah.
Well, friends,
Yes.
On that high note,
but the high note is, based on all that, the high note is we aren't where we want to be, but the first step into getting to where we want to be is having these type of conversations, having people who are open-minded enough to kind of see that we're not where we want to be. It's that realization first before we can even get there. So I say all that to say thank you guys for inviting us to be here.
For sure.
Well, thank you for joining us and helping us move into a space of greater understanding, of, I hope, greater enlightenment. I won't say greater wokeness. I'm not sure we can claim that. But at least a position which allows us to have greater empathy, which leads to greater love of neighbor. And that's our goal here. Because the unmasking and the dismantling of racism is an act grounded in love of neighbor.
Yeah.
Amen.
Yeah.
That would definitely be every Sunday.
All
right, I'll put it on the docket for next week. Ken and Rich, thank you so much for joining us. This has been, unintended, a very rich conversation. And I invite everyone to come back and join us next Sunday, or by the time this drops this Sunday, when we discuss a closely related topic, bail reform. So thank you so much to Ben and Rich, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Peace.
Absolutely.